Assalamu alaikum, students. The poem that we'll be doing today is The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. Coming to the text of the poem, girls, it's a fairly simple poem written in very simple words, and it's very short and almost constitutes of a single sentence that has been broken into little pieces of words. So much depends on a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. And that's about it for the text of the poem. Now, this particular poem is a classic example of a free verse. A free verse is a special way of writing a poem. It is again a literary device that has been devised as a kind of poetry that does not have any limitation. So there is no specific meter or rhythm or rhyme. So the poets can sort of express themselves in any possible way that they want to without having to stick to a certain rhyme scheme or certain rules. And so this is a very modern way of expressing poetry, where poets felt that their artistic expression should not be inhibited by a certain rule or certain regulations, and hence the free verse, as the name denotes, came into being. So in this way, the poet can also give his own shape to a poem, just the way he or she desires. However, it allows the poet to use, as per their requirement, these various literary devices such as alliteration, rhyme, and cadences. Cadences also refers to different form of images and rhythms, so that they can all create the effect or the expression that they wish to express. And then again, a lot of literary devices have been used even in this particular poem, even though on the first read, it does not come across as such, and it comes across as something that is simply mentioning a wheelbarrow. Now, coming to slightly the context of the poem, girls, The Red Wheelbarrow was first published in 1923 by this American poet who's known as William Carlos Williams, an American poet, very famous. And despite the fact that this poem is rather cryptic, as in like it is ambiguous and there is not much clarity, there is no context that is set in this particular poem. It simply describes in very few words a wheelbarrow next to white chickens. So the poem is very sort of vague in that sense. Even though the diction, even though the words used are very simple, yet it is a poem that has a certain lack of clarity. It consists of a single sentence, girls, which describes a wheelbarrow, a red wheelbarrow, which is wet with rain, and it is simply standing next to some chicken. The only other information given to us is rather vague. And when the speaker says that so much depends upon this wheelbarrow, the reader likely wonders that what depends on this wheelbarrow, because that is one question that remains unanswered throughout the narrative of the poem. I have just put in this picture here, girls, so that you can actually imagine or actually see for yourself what exactly is the portrayal of the whole poem. So this exactly, so that's a red wheelbarrow, just in case most of you don't know what a wheelbarrow looks like. So this is the red wheelbarrow, and this is exactly what it looks like. And it's here in this particular open area with a couple of chickens around it. So, and right next to it is the text of the poem. So you can have a closer look and analyze. This is what the poem is actually depicting. Now, if you look at this poem, girls, apart from the fact that it's a free verse, it is also a piece of imagist poetry. That is, the whole poem constitutes of a single image, and that image focuses on the red wheelbarrow. Now, there's a very precise, to-the-point depiction of the red wheelbarrow. However, this does not mean that the poem has no meaning at all. Even though there's a lot of attention that is paid to the image of the wheelbarrow, it is possible that the speaker is observing and appreciating the everyday necessity of manual labor. So if you're really to look at it, and even if you look around in your college, this particular wheelbarrow comes in very handy for doing different chores, carrying things from one here to another, picking up things from one place to another. So when we talk about manual labor, labor that is done with the hand, the wheelbarrow for the longest time stood as an image of manual labor or doing things with your hands, the importance of doing things with your own hands. And therefore, when a wheelbarrow or any person, as a matter of fact, takes around a wheelbarrow and does different things out in the open, there is a connection that is established of man with nature through the wheelbarrow. So therefore, the wheelbarrow in itself stands on this image of a connection between man and nature. The Red Wheelbarrow Girls by William Carlos Williams might seem like a rather bizarre poem, like a silly poem, a poem that doesn't make sense at all, and it might also come across to some readers as absolutely meaningless. But if you deeply consider it and analyze it, you will see that there is layers and layers of meaning to the poem. And if you're really to look at it, it seems like the red wheelbarrow is something that goes overlooked, something that we do not even notice because it's so unimportant. It is considered to be extreme, even though there are so many uses to it, and there is so much that it comes in handy for, yet we don't really appreciate it, we don't really discuss it, we don't really talk as much as we should, given the importance of a wheelbarrow within the domain of anybody who is doing some sort of manual labor. So the fact that the poet talks about a red wheelbarrow is very, very important, because he's trying to give the wheelbarrow the due importance that generally people do not give to it. So the poem Girls Red Wheelbarrow is also in certain ways sentimental, and it lends some sort of nostalgia, and then also it depicts some sort of nature. So maybe the poet in one way or the other is thinking about his old days when he was probably doing things that involve the red wheelbarrow. When we talk of nature, girls, the wheelbarrow maybe is by Williams, his own depiction of an incredibly important tool. Now, like I told you, anybody who is doing some sort of work outside will require a wheelbarrow to do different form of things, whether it is picking up leaves from one another, whether it has to do with plantation or other things. The wheelbarrow is centrally important. So William sees it as something upon which practically the whole world hinges. So he's giving it a lot of importance. You know, for a person working out of doors, his whole world really, really depends on the wheelbarrow. And through this focus, William is also asking his readers to consider nature and humankind's connection with it. So he thinks that it is a tool that allows for rural and farming communities to make a living and support their families day to day. So for a farmer or for somebody who's using the wheelbarrow, it is also a means of livelihood and feeding their families. Now, if William here presents the single red wheelbarrow, something of extreme importance, high importance. He wonders in awe in regards to its various uses and ever-present nature. So there are two important things about the wheelbarrow. It does not have a single use. There are so many uses to a wheelbarrow. And the other thing, which is very, very important, is that it is something that is always present. It is always out there for anybody who works for it. And it stays out of doors because it is so part of the nature that it remains unharmed. So once the use of a wheelbarrow is over and done with, nobody really bothers bringing it indoors. It stays outside. So if you have to take a close look, and even though if you have to see the poem itself, it is a very brief poem. And so through the brevity of the poem, the poet is actually trying to tell the reader that we need to analyze and we need to look at the wheelbarrow and give it its due importance, which we probably do not in our day-to-day lives. Coming to the structure of the poem, girls, the red wheelbarrow is a 4-stanza poem that is separated into sets of 2 lines, which are known as couplets. Couplets, as we've described before, also form a verse that constitutes of 2 lines. These lines are extremely short and unusual. The first line of each stanza has 3 words, and then if you look at the second line of each, there is only 1 word. So William chose to write this piece in free verse. Like I told you, free verse having no rhyme scheme to it. This means that there is no single pattern of rhyme or meter at work in this text. If you look at the language of the poem, it is very simple, very conversational, very everyday. And when you read it, it sort of creates a very calm and casual tone because there are no sort of difficult words that you wouldn't understand. Looking at the literary devices that have been used in the poem, the 3 major ones include alliteration, juxtaposition, and imagery. So imagery is probably one of the most obvious and important literary elements in the poem. By using images clearly, William is trying to ensure his readers to connect with the sentiments that he is interested in. So he's used the image of the wheelbarrow, which is the central image, to show that he is more concerned about the things that most people are not concerned about, that exist in our everyday life, yet we do not give them the due importance. Now, juxtaposition, girls, is another interesting and important technique that helps to convey the meaning behind the red wheelbarrow. The clearest example of this technique is the wheelbarrow itself, which in a non-poetic context is unimportant, and the importance that William bestows on it. So juxtaposition is when you bring 2 things side by side in order to create an image. So in this case, the wheelbarrow has been placed in a certain context, in a non-poetic context, a context which is generally not a part of poetry. The wheelbarrow itself is generally not the topic in most poetic forms. So the poet, by bringing in the wheelbarrow in the middle of a field, or as he depicts amidst the white chickens, juxtaposes 2 very sort of unpoetic scenarios to bring together his own point of view. And through that, he tries to bring in the importance of the wheelbarrow, and he believes it is that particular pivotal point or hinge on which the entire world rests. Alliteration, again, is a very, very formal device that is used in poetry, and it has to do with the use and reuse of words in order to focus on something. If we are to see how technically it is done, it has to do with the repetition of consonant sounds. As you're probably aware, there are 2 basic sounds, vowels and consonants. So anything that is not a vowel is a consonant. So words, the use of words, so the repetition of the word R in rain and red is an example of alliteration, and similarly the repetition of the alphabet B in barrow and beside is also an example of alliteration in the poem. Each example takes on a greater significance in the poem due to the overall brevity of the text, because it is such a brief text, hence alliteration here comes forth with a lot of force. Again, if we are to see the structure of the poem, it is a very unconventional structure, apart from the fact that it constitutes only of a single sentence, which has been broken into little pieces. There is also no capitalization throughout the poem, which goes on to depict that there is not one single thing that needs to be given importance, and yet everything is equally important. And only on reading on it, you realize that maybe the single image of the wheelbarrow on its own through the description comes out as important. The poet himself is not trying to capitalize anything or force onto the reader that something is more important than the other. Concluding the poem, girls, on a final note, we need to know that the wheelbarrow is something that is red. Now, if we are to see the context of American farming or English farming, the wheelbarrow generally in our part of the world is not red, but over there, it is typically red and typically cliche. So usually a barn or a farm has a fence that is red in color, and along with that, the wheelbarrow is also red in color, which goes on to show that because it is so typical and it is so commonplace, we tend to overlook the wheelbarrow, and because it blends in so much with its surrounding, we also don't give it much importance, despite the fact that the wheelbarrow is so central to human life. It is so central to manual labor, and it sort of establishes such a connection between man and nature. And this is exactly what the poem is telling us, that common tools, everyday use tools that are so important to our day-to-day living, and probably is a means of livelihood for me, a lot of people out there in the world who are involved with farming or some sort of manual labor. We need to give due importance to those little tools, and we need to give them the due importance that is so needed. And hence, this is exactly the main thematic concern of this piece of poem. Thank you so much, girls, and I hope you understand.